Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today, I'm probably going to title this video, The Anatomy of a Woke Story, or Why We Desperately Need Heroes. And by the way, I use the word woke in my title. I'd rather use the word progressive because it's much more descriptive and much more accurate. I just used woke in the thumbnails because it fits much easier than the word progressive. And I know I've done videos like this in the past, but I'm going to concentrate this time much more on the anatomy of the mindset behind a quote-unquote progressive story, how that plays out within the storytelling, especially trope-wise, and how the entire thing is a rejection of the traditional idea of a hero, and why then we need to return to the traditional idea of a hero. But before we get there, if you want a traditional hero, I have graphic novels. There are 2 superhero graphic novels, one return to form for low fantasy, all focusing on the traditional idea of a hero. There's also my new book, which is coming out, called Fade to Blue. It's a combination of Indiana Jones as if it was told in film noir. So the links for those are in the description and the pinned comment. I'd very much appreciate it if you just clicked on that link for Fade to Blue. Go on over, watch the trailer, maybe look at some of the art, see if it's for you. If it is, leave your email address and you'll be informed when the project goes live. You're looking at some of the beautiful art from that book in the background right now. And as I said, all of my stories are told centering around the concept of the traditional idea of a hero. And we'll get into that just in this video. All right, so back to the topic. And usually when I start a topic, especially if it's out of the blue, I like to give you my mindset for the week and why I started thinking about these ideas. Well, this week it's for 2 reasons. One, I was, in a roundabout way, helping a friend out with looking up some things about psychology. And number 2, for the last couple of weeks, I've been rereading a section of my older Avenger comics, somewhere between 150 and 300. And during the week, I read Avengers number 181. And I'm putting that up in the background so that you can see it and it can tell the story visually while I talk about storytelling. Now, if you're watching, you've already seen that the very first page of that book gives the title for Avengers 181 as On the Matter of Heroes. And it's an interesting book that starts to talk about what a hero is and bookends the book at the first and at the end by Wonder Man comparing it to acting and how he needs to act like a hero first so he can feel like a hero later. And that's contrasted with the main plot of the story, which is the government sticking its nose into the Avengers for the first time really in this much intensity, saying it will not give them priority status unless it controls the Avengers. And so the Avengers must submit to the government, and the government then says, you're just too strong, there's too many people here, we need to pare it down to, I think it is 7 members, and the government gets to choose those members. And oh, by the way, of those 7 members, the 7th one is the Falcon, which is appropriate for today after Captain America Falcon came out. Why? Because the Falcon wasn't actually a member of the Avengers at any point. And the reason why, I think it's Henry Gyrich, is saying, no, you need the Falcon, is because of why? Well, he specifically says it, it's affirmative action. And this ticks Hawkeye off to no end because he gets kicked off the team. And Hawkeye, as part of the subplot for this issue and a number to follow, proves that he's supremely capable. He's just a man, and yet he's supremely capable. As I said in other videos, he's a man who is so capable, he can stand on a battlefield with gods and still come out relatively unscathed. But he's passed over for affirmative action. Not to mention the fact that they chose Falcon over Thor, Hercules, really immensely powerful beings. But anyway, that's the story that's being told in the background. And that's the story that was told in the background of my mind over the last week while I was looking at psychological underpinnings for a lot of the brokenness for our society, individually and culturally. And also on my last Wednesday live stream, because I do live streams with John's Longbox every Wednesday, we started to talk about what is the problem with our society. And his idea was people are just too fragile. And I said, yes, but I think it's more that they're too emotionally fragile, too psychologically fragile. And the why and the how of that explains so much about current quote-unquote progressive storytelling. Now, I've been a big proponent of the idea, even from the time that I was in high school studying ancient history, that the breakdown of societies starts to really occur with the breakdown of the family unit. This was true for ancient Rome, and it's true for us today. And if you look at current psychology, although they don't want to admit it, it pretty much confirms that as well. Why? Because your society is only as tough as the members of the society are, and those members of the society are only as tough as they are mentally tough. If they can't take mental strain, then they're not tough people. And how does a person become mentally tough? Well, through good upbringing in a good nuclear family. And this has been the focus of so much psychology for the last, 75 years. But it is on the assumption, and it is an assumption that has been carried on in Western civilization for millennia, going back, at least 500 BC, at least. The idea that man is a social creature. And he is meant to be a social creature, and he needs that society and the most basic unit of that society, which is the family, to help him become a healthy and whole individual. So much so that there are basic things that seem normal in our society and are touted as absolutely normal, which psychology would list as either neglect or abuse. Those are simple things like living in a household where you have one parent, having your parents divorced. Modern psychology would say that leads to, at the very least, neglect. Again, they don't want to admit that in the open, but that's where a lot of psychology goes. And if you add onto that the additional strain of, let's say, you have only your mother to rely on, and she has to provide for everyone, and she's not there because she's out providing, then that neglect can turn into abuse. Very simply, like the fact that she simply doesn't have time to listen to your problems. Or she's so stressed out that she complains when you come to her with a problem. These things are listed as abuse. Why? Because it leads to you becoming a person who does not think that their emotions are valid. And that further leads to you repressing your emotions, and so growing up in a situation where you simply do not know how to deal with emotional strain. And so you push it away, you avoid it, you shove it down. And trust me, as a member of Gen X, yeah, I know this all too well. That's not my personal experience, but that was the society around us. That was the society that was being touted as the norm. Now, this kind of neglect and this kind of abuse can lead to several different outcomes. And I hate using this word, but outcomes on a spectrum because they get progressively worse. But I'm going to talk about simply one of them. And that's the worst one of them, which is completely avoiding your emotions. Why? Well, for three reasons. Number one, because it sums up the other two, because the other two lead to the third. Number two, because this form is the form that people can, at the very least, still engage with society in a semi-healthy way. That is to say, you don't need to be put in an institution, but it's right on that edge because it can easily tip over into what they call disorders, which are varied and lead to things like actual mental illness where you see things that aren't there, delusions, etc. So we're going to go right up to that line, but not cross it. And number three, because the one I'm focusing on actually describes and connects to so many of the modern quote-unquote progressive storytelling tropes. And the first of those tropes is something that is connected to what I just said a minute ago. The idea that whenever you come to the person you're supposed to depend on most, which is your parents, which have been pared down to your parent, and they dismiss your asking for help because what they're supposed to do is help you and then pattern for you the correct way in order to deal with your emotions, in order to deal with problems. Therefore, you can become emotionally secure and deal with problems yourself as you get older and older. But if you don't have that, you start to think to yourself, okay, I'm alone in this if I want to survive, because children think about, okay, if I get abandoned, I'm going to die, because it can literally be true. But it leads to the idea that I'm alone, I have to deal with this alone, no one's going to help me, and that's the way life is. Now, this is not something new. This is something that you've seen in stories for a long time. It's typically called the child raised by wolves syndrome. Why? Because he's not connected to the society. He or she, man is a social animal, a social creature. If there's no society around them that they can depend on or think that they can depend on, then they become a child raised by wolves. I am the only one who can depend on myself. There is no one but me. I have to deal with all my problems. This leads to the quote-unquote progressive trope of, I don't need no man. The girl boss individual that you see within the pages of quote-unquote progressive storytelling. And, oh, by the way, even neurochemistry confirms the fact that, yes, we are social creatures because the body speaks to the brain through transmitters. Those transmitters usually receive three kinds of chemicals in order for the body to speak to the brain. Those are typically dopamine, tryptophan, and oxytocin. Dopamine you can get by yourself, but is only a very sharp spike upwards followed by a spike downwards. Tryptophan, however, is usually produced with you solving a problem with other people, it being a much more lasting and enduring motivator. And oxytocin is usually gained by things like romantic love, with the fulfillment of a man and a woman joining their lives together and solving problems together, and then they have all three. And yes, it's man and woman. And oxytocin is the strongest of the three, and it lasts the longest of the three. And all of these three chemicals do what? They motivate you to get up and do things. Otherwise, you just sit there in a pile. At best, you become depressed. At worst, you see no use for this life. And that's why those chemicals are so important. That motivation is literally whittled down to the will to live if you don't have them. Now, a couple of things off of that. This explains why you have your quote-unquote progressive people who typically look the way that they do. Unkempt, unhealthy, verging more and more on the heavier end of the spectrum, and quite angry. Not to mention terminally online. This is because they reject the entire idea of the basis of our society and what psychology has pretty much proven, which is that man is a social animal, and not just a social animal in any way, but a social animal who becomes a fully healthy person and member of that society by growing up in a family as a child with a mother and a father that take care of them. In rejecting that, or in living that and then rejecting it, they are cutting themselves off from the higher levels of motivating biochemistry, and they're left pretty much with dopamine. That's it. And they have typically very low dopamine levels, which gives you very little motivation to do things like take care of your physical appearance. It also explains the heightened levels of anger in a number of ways, one of them being that anger gives you a very sharp hit of dopamine. Same with the overweight thing. Eating gives you a quick source of dopamine. And if you have no other source of dopamine, what are you going to do? You're going to eat a lot constantly. And at the same time, the problem with thinking that you are the only one that you can depend on puts you in the situation of child raised by wolves. And what does that mean? That means that your fight or flight system is on pretty much constantly, because we're not built for that. We're built for living in societies where we can trust the people around us and ask them for help. But if you don't believe that, if you believe everyone and everything is out to get you because you can only depend on yourself, then you're in a constant fight or flight status. And when you're in that status, what does your body do when you eat? Well, it takes the food and it turns it into fat, because that's what your body does when it's under stress. It says, I don't have time to process food. You're in a life or death situation. We'll just pack it away for later. And lastly, it explains why they're terminally online, because again, especially social media gives you a very sharp hit of dopamine when you first start to use it, and leads to basically being a drug, because drugs give you very sharp hits of dopamine. And like any addiction, you need more and more of it in order to get even the base level of dopamine up. That's what social media does. That's why a lot of this quote unquote progressive stuff begins on social media. That's why these people are terminally online. Now, to address the elephant in the room that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, what about stories like Tarzan? Stories like Man with No Name Western, the hyper individual of stories from the past like the Man with No Name Western. Well, for Tarzan, I would say, yeah, sure, he's a man raised by wolves, basically, man raised by apes. They do have some social structure. But then again, think about what the most famous line of Tarzan is. The one that I would say sticks mostly in our collective consciousness is, me Tarzan, you Jane. Why? Because he gets to a point where he wants to get that connection, that ultimate motivator connection of man and woman in a romantic sense. On the other hand, the Man with No Name Western is really about broken individuals. These are not role models. It's funny, John and I were asked a question 2 weeks ago in our live stream about what fictional character do you most not want to be? And John and I answered that question both at the same time, both coming up with the same answer. Batman. Neither of us would want to be Batman. Why? Because that's a miserable existence. Sure, not in every story. And sure, they had to introduce things like the Batman family, the Robins, Alfred. Those are things which get him to actually move outside of his, we'll say, trauma zone and become a healthier individual. But yeah, don't care. Don't care how rich Bruce Wayne is. Don't care if I have a Batmobile. Don't want to be Batman. That's a miserable existence. And that's literally the late 1980s plot of Nightwing, and why Nightwing became a character in his own book. In the first pages of his own book, he says, I was trained to be the next Batman. I was trained to replace Bruce Wayne when he could no longer be Batman. but who in the world wants to be Batman? Now let's bring this entire thing out of storytelling and start to talk a little bit about storytellers. What I've covered for the last, 7, 8 years on this channel is mostly Marvel Comics, Marvel Entertainment more as a whole, and I've listened to so many podcasts that came straight from Marvel.com about these new quote-unquote progressive people who have taken over, especially Marvel Comics, but now more and more all of Marvel, running into Disney. And in listening to these people talk to themselves, talk to other people like themselves about their own company filled with people like themselves, these people describe the exact same existence for themselves and everybody around them over and over again. And two things usually come out in those interviews, and it doesn't matter if it's a writer or an editor or a vice president, they all seem to come to the point where they say in the interview, yes, I'm seeking psychological help. I'm seeing a therapist. Their assumption is everybody is, because again, they assume everybody is like them, because again, they assume that the way that they were brought up and the mentality that they have, which is a child raised by wolves, therefore I can only depend on myself, is the only way that people can exist, and they expect everyone to do the same, which by the way leads to them thinking that if you're trying to depend on me to help you out, get away from me. There's something wrong with you. To depend on other people? You're a child. That's how they think. That's why they reject, by the way, deep friendships and really emotionally connecting romantic relationships, which is, again, opposite sex. But the other point that usually comes up is, oh, and by the way, I hate my parents. Or at the very least, severely dislike my parents for what they have done to me. Gee, I wonder if those two things are connected. But this comes up most especially with the writers. And it leads them into a sorry existence. One of the podcasts that I covered was one I talk about every once in a while, which is a Writer Guild of America, where they talk about subverting legacy characters by making them part of the Rainbow Flag Coalition. And one of the people on that panel, I don't even remember his name. It's the person that Zach always talks about, the guy who thinks he's a girl, who's really the biggest name to write for Marvel and DC. Name's really not important. But one of the other panel members said, I wish I was you. And the response was, no, you don't. And then he said, when you get into a position like mine, basically where his entire life revolves around this rainbow flag characteristic, the only people that you get to interact with is other people of similar demeanor in the Rainbow Flag Coalition. And again, the woman repeated, I wish I was you. And he said, no, you really don't. It was such a sad exchange because literally this man's brokenness has become his entire existence and he is nothing but sad and alone. And again, to get back to the psychological just for a minute, to go back into storytelling, if you grow up in this way and that's how you become an adult, thinking that you're all alone, you're the only one who can deal with your problems and that's the way it should be, and how you deal with your emotions is you shove them down, you ignore them, you repress them, which by the way, doesn't work. They will eventually come out and usually overwhelm that person when they do. But if you believe that, a secondary belief that creeps into your mind is the fact that since the only thing I can really control is myself, and I control myself by shoving away everything I think that is negative, but the only way that I can interact with anyone and anything in the outside world is if they are perfect. And if they're not perfect, get rid of them, because they don't have the psychological means to deal with the problems that would arise from people and things that aren't perfect. And this is key to understanding the type of storytelling that these people want everywhere. We've already talked about the I don't need no man trope that this would engender, but what I just talked about also leads to the trope of the Mary Sue. Because here's the thing, if you expect other people and other things to be perfect, and you're only going to interact with them if they're perfect, you're in for a heck of a surprise, because people and things are not perfect. And as soon as they fail you, you will cut them out of your life if you're one of these people. And again, lead you to being sad and alone, dealing with everything yourself in this idea that hyper-independence is the heroic thing to do. It's not. It's the way to destroy yourself. But again, the idea that there can be perfect people and things out there is firmly fixed in their mind. And that leads to a Mary Sue. That leads to them telling stories about Mary Sue's, the perfect person who needs nobody. This also leads into partly narcissistic tendencies, by the way, not to say that everybody who has narcissistic tendencies is a narcissist. Those are two different things. Narcissistic tendencies of I'm a Mary Sue and other people around the Mary Sue do what? Well, in narcissistic psychological language, they become flying monkeys. It's a term generated from the Wizard of Oz story. They circle around the main character and just praise them. And this leads to, of course, the tropes that you see within these Mary Sue stories where even reality itself warps itself, most notably seen in the warping of continuity, warps itself around the individual to affirm them. Affirm them as what? Affirm them as the perfect person, because they believe there can be a perfect person. And this also leads to why these people choose the specific type of political ideology to back. What type is that? Well, it's the socialist type of ideology that says you can have a utopia. Follow us and utopia will be yours. A utopia where everyone and everything is perfect. Because that's what utopia is. And that is supremely attractive to such people because they have no way of dealing with conflict. Internally, externally, doesn't matter. They can't deal with conflict and they can't deal with the emotions that arise from conflict. Therefore, everything around them needs to be perfect. There can be nothing but showers of praise. And that's what utopia offers them. And that's why they push this socialist mentality. Not to mention the fact that this socialist mentality, I can go back to primary documents from, at the very least, 1913, saying that, yeah, go look for these broken psychological people and use them as cannon fodder. They're good for that because they can be easily manipulated and they're supremely angry, so you can use them as a weapon. Say, those are the people that are keeping you from utopia. Go attack them. Now, after all of that, let's get into the reason why the answer to all of this, the answer to the personal struggle of such people and the cultural struggle of our society to get rid of this kind of mindset lies in the idea of a hero in your life and a hero on the page. First of all, the traditional idea of a hero, which is a paragon of virtue, and those virtues are very specific in their order and number. They have been so for, at least 3,000 years. They are preceded by right reason, and those virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, in that order. And the traditional idea of a hero has as its backing several points which contradict the mindset that I just went through. Point number one being, hey, guess what? You're a social animal and you need other people. How does it do that? Well, the strongest of those virtues is typically seen as justice. Prudence is the charioteer. Justice is the lead horse. And justice deals with you dealing with other people, because justice is rendering to everyone what is their due. You assume that if you live out and what more embody these virtues, that you have to be just, and you can only be just if you render to other people what is their due, and you only render other people what is their due in a place where you're in contact with other people, in a society. What more, it is based upon the idea that every individual in our society is a broken individual, that there's going to be pain, and that you have to learn how to deal with it. That's the reason for offering the description of the heroic life to begin with. It's to say, what is the best life? The best life that you can live. Because you're going to have troubles. You're going to have pain. What's the best way to deal with that? Well, it's through virtue. This is where the idea of pathos comes in. The idea that in everybody's life, you have pathos. You have pain that you have to endure. The only question is, how are you going to endure that pain? By being heroic? Or by turning in on yourself? By cutting yourself off from other people? By becoming self-destructive? If you wish to avoid that, you need to move towards the heroic. But all of this means nothing to such people unless it is connected in a way that they understand. Because all of that is just saying the way that you are looking at the world through your child raised by wolf eyes is wrong. You're wrong. And just saying to them, you're wrong, it's the exact opposite of what you think, actually drives them further into the way that they think. Because again, such people cannot handle conflict, nor the emotional upsetting of conflict. So to tell them, hey, guess what? Everything you believe, it's actually wrong. It's actually the exact opposite. Even to suggest such a thing would send them fleeing for the hills. But heroism and heroic stories enter the solution into the entire thing. And that solution is to say, well, there's no such thing as a perfect person. We're all broken. But I can offer you something which is even better. I can offer you the perfect process. The perfect process of dealing with things so that you can actually become healthy. At the very least, as healthy as you can be in this world. And that perfect process is the virtues, is heroism. And it's a perfect process not because it is one entire package that if you do it once, it's perfect. No, quite the opposite. It's the perfect process because it says, yes, you're going to fail when you attempt to do this, but it is not a fault of the process. It is actually a feature of the process. Because What do those virtues, preceded by right reason, do? They act in a circular way. And this sounds very much like the hero's journey, because the hero's journey is just a modern interpretation of the idea, the traditional idea of a hero in a virtuous way. But the point is, when you get right reason, you need that in order to get prudence, which is the first virtue. You need prudence in order to get justice. You need justice in order to get fortitude, and you need fortitude in order to get temperance. And once you become temperate, what does it do? It reorders your right reason, and then it goes right around the circle over and over again. And as you stay on this path and continue around and around in this circle, when you make a mistake, it helps you reorder in a temperate way all of the other virtues and everything else you need. Again, it's a feature, not a bug. It's, oh, this went wrong. Let me use that as new information to understand better how the virtues work, how they relate to each other, how I can be heroic, and in turn, how I can deal specifically with myself, because that's what a lot of prudence, fortitude, and temperance are about, and deal with others, because that's what justice is about. And how do we offer these broken people, these raised by wolves people, this perfect process? Well, hopefully they have someone in their lives, which is heroic, which is virtuous in this way, that can show them the path of this is the proper way for individuals to actually exist. And they gravitate towards such people because they can see that heroism by seeing the outlines of it within the stories around them. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why you see these quote-unquote progressive people trying to destroy traditional heroes and the traditional way of telling a story with a traditional hero all over the place. Because here's one of the other things about human psychology. Human psychology does not point you towards what is going to make you happy. It points you towards what is going to make you safe. That's it. And to such people who are broken in this way, raised by wolves way, the corner that they sit in, where they are sad and alone, is very familiar to them. And familiar equals safe. The unknown equals danger. And the healthy way that people actually should interact with each other is very unknown to them. And that's why a healthy society should tell good, heroic stories about itself. Not only to bolster those people who are heroic, not only to keep its society running in a heroic way, but also to offer to those people who really can't see the point of the entire thing an idea of why heroism works. Because otherwise, they'll be left in their sad and lonely corner, wishing for a utopia, which, even if they were to get it, as an individual, as a culture, as a nation, we know, through history, through philosophy, through theology, through psychology, leads to nothing but hell on earth. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are links in the description for my graphic novels, and for the new stories that are coming out called Fade to Blue, there is a link where you can leave your email address if you wish to be informed when the project goes live, and where also you can watch the trailer and look at some of the art. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later.